Hey everybody, welcome to the Migraine Mentors minicast with your hosts, the Migraine Mentors. I am Dr. Eric Reese with my co-host and esteemed colleague, Dr. Thompson Mayasaka. Today is a topic that is near and dear to both our hearts because we are definitely patients first, doctors second, and now educators and advocates third. We're going to talk about the gut-brain and the brain-gut axis. For those of you who don't know what that is, you will obviously learn more about that tonight. But especially in the context of migraine and just like this whole kind of neurological, structural, metabolic syndrome that migraine really is, I think it's a really relevant topic. So, Thompson, for those who maybe aren't very aware or familiar with the gut-brain axis, why don't you just give us a little refresher on that if you could?
Sure. Yeah, the simplest explanation I've ever heard is it's kind of like your second brain, right? We've all heard the trust your gut. There is a lot of processing that goes on in your stomach, both from a what you eat and how it's metabolized standpoint, from a neurotransmitter production standpoint. A lot of the chemicals that your brain needs to operate effectively are actually made in your stomach. When I learned that, I thought that was really interesting. So it's all about how that network of processes in your stomach influences the function of your brain, which in the context of migraine, very, very important, which is pretty much what we're going to riff about right now. And I've seen endless patients come in. And Eric, I know you can speak to this as well. When the stomach is a mess, typically the migraine frequency is just through the roof.
Yeah, I to be fair, I have had maybe a handful of cases that I've treated successfully that I haven't had to do metabolic or dietary workups on. Every single one of them, myself included, has had to be somebody where you're like, what does your gut look like? What does your diet look like? What do the labs look like? Because most people need help in that category. Most people know that too, though. Like I think that that's the most unsurprising thing for me is like most patients that come in, they're like, yeah, my gut's been bad for years. I mean, what's new? And I'm like, well, it's kind of like diabetes. It's like cancer. It's like obesity, right? These things are common, but they're not normal. And until you have that conversation and you set the tone for that, I think a lot of people are just like, yeah, this is maybe something separate or that I've tried to treat on its own in isolation. But lo and behold, obviously, all of this stuff is tied together. So, especially with migraine, I can't tell you how many patients have come in with underlying autoimmune conditions, SIBO, which is like a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth problems. A lot of them have just like basic nutritional deficiencies, like they're not getting enough B vitamins, which is a massive, massive component for migraine management. Some patients have been vegan, which that's made it even worse because they're not getting, proper quality nutrients like B12, which is a big, big problem for methylation. This kind of goes on. So I think understanding that though is very different than like putting those things into action. So Thompson, I'm curious for you and for the listeners, why don't you talk to people a bit about kind of what you're looking at with those patients and then maybe some suggestions that you've given them to help them course correct a bit.
Yeah. So first question always is, well, do you have any dietary restrictions, or are you aware of anything that you're sensitive to? I think that um, consistently eating a lot of foods that trigger either an autoimmune response or a histamine response is, especially with migraine, the first thing I look at. If they've never heard the word histamine in the context of food, that's always a conversation I like to have.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about that at a different episode, but histamine and migraine go together like fire and gasoline. You just can't have that most of the time. Then go into stress levels. What is your stress like, and how is that affecting the digestion of your food? It's just a simple way to figure out if the stress is affecting the metabolism in the gut. Medications are also a big deal. If you've been a lifelong amitriptyline or Topamax, if you're on these really heavy-duty migraine medications and you're not doing anything proactive to protect the flora in your stomach, I think you're missing a huge opportunity there to kind of counteract some of the side effects on the medication. So I'll always ask about medication. And then supplements. I think, Eric, I know you're going to touch on this in a bit, but if you're not making a concerted effort to take a good quality methylated B vitamin, perhaps, if you're not looking up some of the nutrient deficiencies that your medications tend to produce, that's also a huge overlooked aspect of taking care of your stomach. How's your alcohol consumption? How's your coffee consumption? Are you eating food before you drink coffee in the morning? So all these little questions just kind of add up, and as you start to ask them, you can get a pretty good idea of, okay, this person is taking zero care of their stomach, which in the context of migraine such a huge deal. I've never seen someone with a terrible gut not have terrible migraines.
Hmm.
How about you, Eric? Did I miss anything? What are some of the things you're looking at?
No, I, outside of just doing a basic examination on patients, I was asked about food sensitivities. I'll ask about their relationship with food. I've just realized in the past that sometimes people have underlying things like even like anorexia or like bulimia and things maybe I've overlooked in the past clinically that I've realized are really important factors. And so when I talk about food, I forget that there's inherently components emotionally that there could be some previous or pre-existing traumas in there. So that's been eye-opening, and I've learned that just with dealing with patients. Nobody told me the best way to go about that. So the failures kind of sit out for me as things that are really guiding my ship on that. Um, but nutrition is inherently always going to be a conversation. Um, when we get a patient in the office, it's like, listen, we're going to look at you structurally, we're going to look at you neurologically, we're going to just get as much data as we can. But inherently, in some capacity, we're going to have to show you how to maintain a lifestyle that is worth maintaining from a standpoint of allowing you to live symptom free, decrease your migraine frequency, and really just get you into a healthy state. I mean, most of the time, it's not even just migraine issues, right? It's the fact that they have migraines, but they don't sleep well. They also have like maybe some emotional issues, like they're depressed or they're anxious. Maybe they're in chronic pain as well, and maybe it's not even in the head. Like maybe they have like low back issues. Like there are a multitude of things that you have to kind of consider when treating patients. And so, for me, you know, the intake is huge, but building that conversation and that trust up is a really big component, because once people kind of trust you and they are open to new ideas, like things like fasting or taking a supplement, I think we inherently make an assumption that people want to take supplements. Not everybody does. And so understanding those areas and then just trying to make sure that I'm meeting them where they're at. That's really kind of my focus on that. So, um, Thompson, you mentioned this gut brain axis, and it's still a bit of an elusive thing. Like maybe talk a bit about just like the neurology behind the gut brain axis. Like I think people just think it's like a bunch of bugs living in our gut, but there's a ton of neuroscience in there too. That might be something to be helpful for people to understand as well, because my understanding, anyways, is that there are probably like 2 to 500 million neurons in your like digestive tract, and there's actually more neurons in your digestive tract than there's your spinal cord. Which, when you think about that on the surface, it's a bit of a trip. So, if you could just maybe elaborate a bit on kind of your take on that and how you kind of educate patients on it.
Yeah, yeah, I take a kind of sort of the opposite approach that you just took is when you start to try and communicate a really complex idea, I have a tendency to go over people's heads when you're trying to explain things. So I purposely make it really simple, specifically on this topic. And I just think of the stuff you put in your stomach needs to fuel the energy that happens in your brain. So it makes sense that if something is wrong with the organ that turns food into something your brain can consume, that your brain's just not going to get the energy it needs. Is sort of the path that I take. You could go on and on about the enteric nervous plexus and how all of the intestines in your body have its own separate branch of the nervous system, and how the intestinal flora have tendency to get imbalanced and you get stuff like SIBO. All of that stuff I tend to just sort of forego in that first appointment unless it becomes like an actual topic of discussion.
Hmm.
Um, specific to migraine, the point that I'll make is if your stomach is messed up, you can't make serotonin, and serotonin is the main thing that helps your body block out pain. So if you're deficient in serotonin, either from a genetically small midbrain, which is where it's produced, or from an abnormal stomach environment, you're not making the main hormone that, when you're having a migraine, inhibits the pain. It's a huge, huge deal. In the context of migraine, I would say that's the thing I probably focus on the most. Obviously, energy and metabolism is a big thing just to feel normal and function well. But if you are specifically going after the stomach in order to reduce some of the migraine symptomatology, that's probably the biggest one I'll go after and support. And I might supplement to support it as well.
Yeah, there's a reason people are on SSRIs. for migraine symptoms is because they work, but then two is most people look at that as like, well, that's what you take with depression and anxiety and kind of PTSD. Well, there's some similar circuits in there with regulating emotion, pain, fight or flight, stress responses, and yada yada yada. So very relevant. That's a really good example too for talking about just food that goes into your stomach has to feed your brain, because it inherently puts a link together between those two. What's really interesting is that there's also a link between like your brain and your gut. So like they've done these studies in rats where it can induce a concussion, and they'll go and like do these like slices of like their intestinal tract, and they'll go from these like really kind of thick castle walls to like opening up the floodgates, which is not good. You want your stomach to be really selective with what it lets into your bloodstream, and everything else hopefully just gets taken out, right? So if you've ever had a bad meal or gotten, we'll say norovirus, right, which is relevant right now, you know that you don't want that going internally. You want to just get rid of everything as quick as possible. It's the same thing. And so highly relevant for patients with migraine and also too just in general. So um, yeah, I think a lot of people really get a good understanding of what we're talking about. This is definitely a topic that we could go on and on and on about. Thompson, anything you want to leave the listeners with today that can be actionable or takeaway for them?
I would say the biggest thing is understand if you have adverse reactions to different foods, whether it's a sensitivity or a histamine response. Those are the two biggest things in relation to food that can dramatically affect your migraine frequency. So the easiest way to figure that out is just get a food sensitivity test. As one way, elimination diets are a little bit more hardcore way to do it, but those are also effective. And then in regards to histamine, I mean, histamine and migraine are, the more people I tell about that, the more I'm just completely convinced that every person that has ongoing migraine should eat a histamine friendly diet. We could have a whole conversation on that. But those two things I would say, if you're in the process of fixing your stomach health, look into those first. What
Agreed.
about you?
Yep. Yeah, no, outside of that, I think just healthy gut, healthy brain, healthy life. Like that's always a simple, easy thing to understand. You feed your gut and you're feeding your brain inherently, and you feed the rest of your body. For this relevant example too, and what we're talking about today, the big thing that we're talking about, not only supporting your gut, but then the brain, is just B vitamins. And the article today that we're talking about with the newsletters about how B vitamins could actually be hurting you. There's specific different types of B vitamins, and what I'm referencing is methylated versus non-methylated B vitamins. Most people who are dealing with migraine symptoms or just chronic disease in general are poor methylators. There's a lot of people that have different genetic predispositions. I'm one of them, so I think that's probably why I, started graying when I was in my late 20s, why just like, things happen for a reason. And so when you're aware of that, you can supplement, you can support it, you can eat a methylated kind of more friendly diet. And I think that that's really an actionable takeaway, is to make sure whatever you're putting in your body or on your body, it's there to support and facilitate, not necessarily just because it's a good idea. So
For sure. For those listening, can you give the very sort of simplified version of what it is to methylate something?
yeah, I think of it as a light switch, right? It just turns something on, turns something off. It's either activating a molecule or it's inactivating a molecule. So there are a bunch of different SNPs and things genetically, and I think that's probably one of the most talked about ones, which is why we bring it up. Because as you know, genetics kind of load the gun, but the environment will pull the trigger based off of what you do and don't do. So most patients that come into the clinic who show different alterations in their metabolic processing or even homocysteine when I run a lab, they will almost likely be, hey, we can run this lab, we can run the test to see if you are set up for it, or you can just make sure you just look out for it. So there's multiple ways to approach it. So yeah, always an interesting topic. I don't know. Anything else you'd add to that?
B vitamins are such a big deal with migraine, especially a B
Mm,
complex. I believe it's 1, 2, 6, and 12 are all
yeah.
of the ones that are primarily deficient in people with ongoing migraine. So if you haven't started taking a methylated B complex, that could easily be a very effective takeaway from this little mini cast.
Yes. Very quick, very simple, and you're going to just pee out what you don't use. So that's the best part about it.
Right.
With that being said, great place for us to stop. For those of you who are listening, thank you for joining us. For those of you who are subscribers to the Migraine Mentors newsletter, thank you for your support. We appreciate it, and we appreciate the feedback and how engaged people are. Like, this is just a fun community that we've been able to be a part of and build. For those of you who aren't subscribers to the Migraine Mentors newsletter, what is stopping you? There's a subscription button below. There's a link for subscribing to the Migraine Mentors newsletter as well. We publish our newsletter every Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. Central Time. And our whole goal is to help you live a migraine-free life by taking less medication and making sure you're living your life holistically. So with that said, we will see everybody at next week's recording.